Welcome to Mr. Policy. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And this is our week in review. We look at last week's topics. Crispin, how are you?
I am marvellous.
Marvellous? Why is that?
Well, I mean, marginally marvellous. Charlene has, because she's like a nutritionist as well as many other things, and she has decided that I would be on this keto diet. Now, I am about as far away from like fad dieting as you can get. Like if I want to diet, it's like calories in, calories out, straightforward, right? But apparently I put my body in a state of ketosis.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Right? By not eating carbs and sugar. Sugar I get. Carbs I'm more skeptical about, but I've been on this diet now for 6 days. And
how are you feeling?
I'm feeling okay. Well, I mean, the I didn't feel it at all until Thursday. I was like, until then I was just like, yeah, this is like, just eating good food. But then like overnight, whenever I go through a physical withdrawal of any product, I will dream about it 100%. I'll have dreams about it. And anyway, overnight I was just dreaming of stuffing my face with cakes, like both carbs and sugar all in one. I was just like, oh. And I woke up and I was so depressed. I did not have any of those things in my house. But we will see how it goes.
Yeah.
We'll track progress over time.
Yeah, exactly. And okay, all right. As a nutritionist, I actually do not recommend fad dieting. I don't really recommend the keto diet either.
What?
In a way that, well, okay. Well, for you, yes, because you want to lose weight like quickly. So, and the reason I recommend it, because I've done it before. Maybe we should put a picture. I don't know. I'm kind of scared. Should I? I don't know. We'll see how I feel.
What, the picture?
My transformation picture.
Oh my God, yeah, you could put that up there. That is crazy. And I mean, probably,
that's what encouraged him to get on it. Like
it's freaky. Like, you know, the people that don't have much weight to lose to begin with, and then they become like anorexic looking. That's the photo. I mean, no, healthy is what I meant to say. But no, it seemed highly effective. So I was like, okay, well, I'll see how this goes. Yeah.
And it teaches you other skills, because obviously it's so restrictive. You can't eat carbs. Carbs are not evil, but just on this diet, you just can't eat carbs. So your primary source of energy comes from fat. And because of that, you need to cook more, and you can't eat sugar or anything like that. So it knocks out all the processed food. So naturally, you're going to eat healthier. Leafy green things is incredible.
So no rice, no like hot chips, no potatoes, no starchy foods, no sugar of any kind, no bread, no like rolls, no or we can have cheese.
You can have cheese.
Can't have milk products though for some reason. Well, milk was.
You can't have milk, but you can have cheese. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm being forced to. I love the double espresso. Love it.
Yeah. You can have nut milk. That's fine. But
yeah. Well, I mean, I actually really like nuts, but I ate too many nuts though.
Yeah, they are high in calorie too. I mean, energy dense. And that's the thing with this diet is like you'll find fats have higher satiety levels, so you'll be less hungry less often, which is great. But yeah. All right, we're not talking about keto this entire conversation, but we'll see. Like, see every week and like make some comments if you notice any difference.
Please don't.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, what do we talk about? So right now, the federal government is thinking about, I think they're in a conversation to create a new policy on how states interact with, the international policies. Am I right?
Yeah. So the federal government, under the Constitution of Australia, has the prerogative over foreign policy. Now, there's some question mark over what is and what is not foreign policy, but it's kind of interpreted to mean formal governments between governments of Australia and foreign powers, right?
Yeah.
And so there are certain things that it'll be interesting to see where this starts and ends. So this obviously all bounds around the fact that the state of Victoria and this Premier Daniel Andrews signed up to China's One Belt, One Road initiative.
And the One Belt, One Road, from my understanding, is just like a collaboration with China so to promote jobs and infrastructure and investment from Chinese
Yeah, that's how it's marketed.
Is
There's like an MOU that's signed to formally join this initiative.
Yeah.
And it's basically a series of infrastructure projects that sort of link China to the rest of the world. So kind of, they're saying that all roads lead to Rome. The Belt and Road Initiative is like reviving the old Silk Roads, creating new ones to places like Australia, and then making China the new kind of Rome, essentially, in being the centerpiece of this pan kind of continental infrastructure. So it's an interesting grand strategy, I would say, from China's point of view,
because it increases dependence on China even more.
among other things, yes, definitely. But it's interesting in this case because it seems very clear cut under the federal government's proposal that if the legislation is passed, the federal government would have the power to basically veto or annul that particular agreement. Where it gets a little bit more blurry, I remember a number of years ago, a local council in Western Sydney, I think it's Marrickville, like sort of inner city hipsterville kind of woke area, and they decided they would have a boycott of Israeli products. Right.
Okay.
So there's a local council that decided that they would have a Israel boycott. I don't know how they were going to implement such a boycott. And you do kind of expect the gerrymandered crazies to occupy local councils, but clearly they should not be involved in international affairs if your job is to make sure the bins are collected on time, right? So it's unclear whether unilateral decisions taken that would be impactful for Australian foreign policy is something that the federal government could overrule, or whether it's just formal agreements. I know that commercial agreements are excluded from this arrangement because I don't think the federal government has the constitutional power to get involved in many of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to know where it starts and ends. It seems like just formal arrangements between subnational governments and foreign powers. So, the government of New South Wales wouldn't be able to enter into a formal deal with the government of Myanmar without the federal government's endorsement.
Yeah. What's like a clear example of where the federal government would have to step in and be like, no, this is not on? Is it more so like, the only example I can think of is being able to give out jobs internationally rather than use like local capacity. That's, I think, maybe, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. So immigration is a federal jurisdiction. So the Commonwealth could just deny work visas. So they have that advantage in that respect. Where it would be like extremely difficult is in certain types of investment. So let's say the federal government wants to ban China from investing in our rail infrastructure. Right? Well, rail comes under the state jurisdictions. So if the state government decides to give a contract to a state-owned Chinese firm, then it's hard to see how the Commonwealth could actually get involved. Where it would be, less, sort of more kind of clear cut will be if the state of South Australia signed an agreement with the government of Japan to say that, whaling is now a good thing and that there'll be like exchanges and promoting whaling in potentially in South Australia. Then the federal government might step in and say, no, that's not, aligned with our foreign policy, ergo it's annulled. So it's not clear
case
yet.
By case, then.
Yes, I mean, I think it's definitely formal agreements between governments, between a subnational Australian government, like a state government or a local government, and a foreign power. I think in educational institutions will be excluded unless they are specifically foreign government aligned, i.e. a military college. So, West Point or something would fall under that. But so it is kind of narrow. And so when people say, like, I think our American friends who get a little bit giddy when they look at Australia and say, oh, Australia's leading the world in the fight against China. Look what they did with Huawei. Look what they did with, calling for an international investigation and so on. And there is a lot of wishful thinking there. Australia's policy towards China is complex. It's contested. And I think the people that Americans are closest to when getting their advice are these sort of Fulbright scholar sycophants who want their, fellowships at Brookings and Stimson and these Washington think tanks and tend to kind of tell Americans what they want to hear.
Yeah.
And we saw this recently when the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence, Reynolds and Payne, they went to Washington for the annual OSMIN consultation. So Australia and the United States have formal meetings between our defence and foreign affairs ministers with our counterparts in the United States. That's part of our kind of alliance management process. And then there's a joint communique, press conference, and they talk about all the things that are going to make the alliance work over the coming year. It's quite there's a bit of pageantry around it, but it is also very much a process tradition. Now, every year it alternates. One year the Americans host us in Washington. The other year they host us. We host them in Canberra. This year it was in Washington, and when Mike Pompeo and Esper came out and gave their speech, Pompeo mentioned China like 10 times in 2 minutes, talking about how Australia was leading the world, how, this is all like stopping Chinese Communist Party, bullying and curtailing their nefarious activities, et cetera, all the things you expect Pompeo to say.
Yeah.
And then particularly in the Q&A, our own ministers, the Australian ministers, got up and said, look, we have a lot of disagreements with America about this. And we're not, participating in your new kind of sort of Asian NATO coalition to contain China. And we value our relationship with China. And like Australia, the only kind of concession Australia gave to these guys was some comments about Hong Kong, because that was pretty low-hanging fruit. The whole world could see what was happening in Hong Kong. But by and large, Australia was very protective of its relationship with China and did so publicly in front of an American audience. Extraordinary. And I don't think the Americans were prepared for that. I think that they were led to believe that, we were going to be joining like freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, and we were going to start, buddying up with Philippines and stuff. We are not in that space. Now, I kind of would like to think we were in different ways, and I think there's a pathway to get us to a more cohesive alliance management approach towards China. But we are definitely not there right now. And Americans are listening to very, very biased people would be the polite way to put it. People that are not proper analysts and are more interested in telling people what they want to hear. And so I think the Americans were grossly ill-served by that. Yeah. So
does that undermine our relationship with the US because they went so blatantly?
No, because I think that there's still a lot of
there's a lot of synergies that we have.
Yes, it hasn't yet. I think once the Americans realise just how big a gap there is between where Australia sits and where they imagine us to be, the penny will drop and they'll start to become more deeply critical. And there are plenty of people within Australia who agree with the American position, for sure. So it's not like, there's anti-American sentiment. But this thing is kind of obfuscated by the whole Trump administration. There's an attitude in Australia, a very poor attitude, that the Trump administration is responsible for all the ills of the world. And therefore, anything that we would do for the Trump White House is going to drag us into unnecessary conflict and some kind of unraveling of the global order. That is just a finger painter's approach to understanding what is really happening out there. Trump hasn't done anything particularly radical in this space except orient the whole American establishment towards China. But in terms of conflicts and struggles, he hasn't gotten into major wars. He has an instinct of realism, and Australia is a part of that. So the fundamental thing for Australia is that we face major choices that we haven't faced before. The fact that this legislation is being introduced at all shows that there's tension within Australia. We had never had to do this before. All throughout our history, there'd been no sunlight at all between the states and the federal government on foreign policy. And now that there are, demarked fissures deep within the different segments of the community about this issue, and it's a contested space, and we need to have a national conversation about it in order to resolve it. I think we will resolve it, but it's going to take a deft hand to keep everyone together and also awaken to the long-term risks and challenges of dealing with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see why it's contested. Everyone has every state and territory in Australia has a kind of different stake with China. And so it's not so much of it. There's no blanket solution. Like you said, I referred to the video, everyone needs to consult, including the private sector as well. And then, I don't know, do you have any ideas? Okay, what happens if we don't have this conversation? What is... Because I can only imagine, what happened to the US is, a lot of the exports of the US went to China, and then China kind of, took hold of technology, and now, in some ways, has surpassed the US. And
so I keep thinking of the American Civil War.
Okay.
When I think of Australia here, there are some disturbing parallels. So, as an Australian, as a foreigner, I can talk about the American Civil War with less prejudice, because in the United States, if you say anything other than the war was completely about slavery, good versus evil, emancipating the slaves from tyranny, et cetera, that was what the entire conflict was about. From start to finish, and that the result was the good guys versus the bad guys, then you'll be cancelled, right? There is this sort of historical truthiness that must be upheld. Now, the fact is that it is half right, that slavery narrative. Where it is absolutely correct is that the Confederacy, which was these states that banded together to secede from the Union, got together out of fears over the institution of slavery, right? So the fact that the Confederacy existed was because they were concerned that slavery would end. So absolutely, that's what drove them out of the Union, and that would be a historical truth.
Yeah.
And their main fear was that as the United States expanded and we got new states joining the Union, if these were non-slave states, then it would be filled with abolitionists, and that because there would be new states, you'd have new senators and Congress people, and that they would tilt the balance in the federal Congress against slavery. And what, to their minds, legitimized that anxiety was the election of Abraham Lincoln, who was elected with a tiny minority of the national popular vote. So all this talk, remember, about 2016 where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Well, Abraham Lincoln lost the popular vote much more lopsidedly than Trump did, but because the location of the electoral colleges, he managed to win. So there was a suspicion among slave-owning Democrats that Lincoln and the Republicans and the abolitionists had gerrymandered the result, right? So they thought that the only way to preserve their traditions of slavery was to cede from the American experiment, right? So they get together as states and declare their independence as the Confederacy, right? So that is all about slavery, okay? But the war itself was not about slavery. The war itself was about preserving the Union. They left the United States. This is in 1861. So the entire United States was only 70 years old, right? So it wasn't particularly developed as it is today. And the northern states declared war on the Confederacy to say that these were rebels and traitors who needed to be invaded and brought to justice. And that started the 4 years campaign. Now, the truth of the fact of the matter is, if the Confederacy put up its arms and said, no, we'll rejoin the Union no matter, that's fine, slavery would have been completely off the table. They would have continued to have their slaves. They would have had their slave trade, and that would have persisted until, presumably some decades later. Without war, like the Emancipation Proclamation didn't happen until 1863. So for 2 years, there was a bloody civil war in the United States, not about slavery, but about preserving the United States. Now, why have I gone on this sort of soliloquy? Well, in the Australian context, we are 6 colonies that have joined together in a federation, which we only did for administrative reasons, right? Like the Commonwealth of Australia is something we celebrate now and apply retrospective myths like Anzac and all other kinds of nonsense to justify ourselves as a nation, right? But really, we are 6 separate colonies, from Botany Bay to Hobart to Perth, where with different histories and traditions and cultures, that has just gotten used to being around one another, right? Like, but we're talking about, if you look at a map, we are a massive landmass with highly isolated cities and very different cultures across these different borders, right? And so the fact that we're federated and stayed in the federation is largely a product because it's never been challenged, right? We just kind of we haven't had internal tensions before, really. Like it's all been played out through football, so this is the first time when, local and national interests at a core and deep level are being challenged. Like when I think of, like, say, the hard border closure of Western Australia, there's the fact that the government there don't want to have, don't want to open up the border and potentially allow the disease into the state, even though constitutionally there can't be state borders, arguably. And there's a whole argument as to whether or not, an exception can be made for this disease because of reasonable steps or whatever, and that will play out in the High Court. But at the start of this, the federal government was entirely on the side of opening up the borders. It was only because it was overwhelmingly unpopular in the state of Western Australia that they withdrew from the case. But they haven't taken a backward step in basically criticising the state of Western Australia for keeping the borders closed. But certainly the federal government of Australia is quite willing to take all the mining royalties, which, constitutionally belong to the states in which they're mined. So on the one hand, all these tensions are boiling over in a way that hadn't been the case before. And in foreign policy, I think that's going to be the strongest one, because that's where we're going to have the most visceral debate because of the centrifugal forces of externals pushing down on us to force us into that situation. So if we think back to what I just said about the American Civil War, there was a group of states in America who, from their point of view, they had joined a revolutionary movement to throw off the yoke of the British, which they did successfully, and they federated in a national republic for administrative reasons to administer these colonies. But at the time, someone from Virginia often thought themselves Virginian, or someone from Mississippi, Mississippian, or Missourian or whatever. Less so American, right? And the fact that we have this disease with these borders is calling into question every Australian's individual identity as whether or not they're a Queenslander or a West Australian or a Victorian. And at first there was like a lot more harmony because the disease was kind of expected to impact everywhere equally, right?
But it didn't.
It didn't, no.
Concentrated within Victoria.
In one place. And here's a a political question. Do you think the federal government would be introducing a bit of legislation specifically targeted at Victoria's Belt and Road Initiative if it wasn't for the fact that the disease had weakened the Victorian Premier, right? Like if Victoria was still super popular, like the Premier of Western Australia is popular, in the Premier of Western Australia, the government of Australia backs off from a massive legal case of which they have clear interest. Yeah. Whereas in Victoria, they're targeting the Victorian Premier on the basis that the pandemic has impacted him politically and therefore left him vulnerable to this kind of legislation. Yeah. This is I approve of the legislation. I do think it needs to be clear that we have foreign policy directed by the national government, right? But I think we are grossly underestimating the secessionist forces that exist within Australia in an environment where the borders are closed and there's a lot of general hostility at a population level across these different parts of Australia. So we need to actually talk openly about this. I think it's a little bit too trite just to joke about it, which is the typical Australian way. I think there are genuine concerns that people in Tasmania have a very different view of things than people from Queensland. I just need to have that dialogue across the board, and I think that the US-China one is the first place to start.
Very true. Okay. This week you also talked about the security of Lithuania. Given by our new Lithuanian audience. Welcome. Thank you for also your support for think your love for Lithuania, that video.
Yeah, so there was a video we did on telling the things that were unique about Lithuania, which there are many, very unsung things. I probably did that about a month ago, talking about pagan Lithuanian history, the age of the language, some of its cultural contributions across different periods of history, and my great personal affection for the country and my desire to be there, whenever I can. But my main area of knowledge is in Lithuanian security in terms of my knowledge of the Baltic. And so, yes, my video was about that. But I do sense that there is, a number of new subscribers who are from Lithuania and probably want to hear more about, the way Lithuania is perceived, the sort of things that we would consider about this important country. And if I can bring it to our broader audience, then that's something I'd dearly like to do.
Yeah, it was very interesting because when you talked about the role of Lithuania and the US and then in Russia. And then you also brought up Sweden, which I kind of want to explore a bit further. So Sweden, you said, is neutral, but it's on the border of Lithuania, right? Or
it's across the Baltic Sea, to the north, and Sweden is, ostensibly neutral in when it comes to sort of NATO and military alliances and that sort of thing.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not part of NATO. It's its own country. Separate to it. However, by virtue of the structure of the new strategic fault lines, it's no longer possible for it to be neutral, even if it wanted to be. It's like in World War II, the Wehrmacht, invaded and mined in Norway in the early stages of the conflict. Even though Norway was neutral, the Germans were afraid of the British using it for its own purposes. Similarly, Sweden, in any conflict between Russia and the Baltic states, Sweden will be absolutely essential in terms of being able to maintain air supply lines for NATO. So Sweden will be brought into the conflict, whether it wanted to be or not. And Russia, knowing this, will target Sweden, irrespectively of whether it's part of NATO or not. So Sweden is... its national security interests are directly impacted by the fact that NATO has spread to Russia's western border. If there was no spreading of NATO, if NATO still existed in Germany, and that was the line, then Sweden would still be off in the north somewhere, kind of out of the way. But because of the fact that Estonia is part of NATO, and that's 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg, just having it across the Baltic, Sweden is a critical linchpin in any contingency that might arise. So I mean, my video about Lithuania was to kind of chart the history of that, some of the main strategic considerations it faces, to kind of give Lithuania a bit of a shout out in its clever alliance management approach towards the United States. The United States the United States is a country that every country in the world seeks to get their attention, right? So the fact that
we mean clever alliance. What do you mean by that? Just a military support?
Well, it's pretty amazing when you think about it that Lithuania managed to join NATO and the EU, and is used as like a flagship in American circles about the way Europe should spend money in terms of its defense budgets and things these conversations will happen in Washington. It's like, well, you should be more like Lithuania. You have this small country, Lithuania, who still manages to spend 2% of its GDP on defense, is pushing in that direction. Why Germany? Why France? Why aren't you doing the same? Why aren't you pulling your weight? So, so it actually, by Lithuania being closer to the United States than perhaps you would expect, it's used as an exemplar to potentially embarrass Western European NATO allies. Now, you might think, well, that's risky. Well, not really. The US, America First foreign policy is all about making sure allies pay their fair share. And therefore, if Lithuania is shown to be an exemplar in that case, irrespective of what you might personally think of the Trump administration or anything like this goes beyond party lines, then Americans will appreciate that and elevate Lithuania in its esteem and prestige. Lithuanian officials will be invited to speak at more prestigious events. You'll have higher level official access. And given the United States is a country that everyone is clambering over to have influence over everywhere, Lithuania has done exceptionally well relative to its size and what you would expect. That's what kind of what I mean. They're just very clever when it comes to managing their alliance with the United States. They what the Lithuanians ask for is security, and the Americans are willing to assure Lithuania of that, and in exchange, what the Lithuanians give is political support. And
do you think NATO works in present day?
Well, that's a huge topic, and I'll certainly do some videos on that. I think that NATO. No, is the short answer, that NATO needs to be ended and replaced by a pan-European strategic architecture that includes Russia as a member.
Okay.
So NATO was an incredibly effective collective military alliance when you were resisting the Soviet Union. But with that, the absence of the Soviet Union, when China is by far and away the vastly greatest strategic risk, what you need to do, what is essential for us to do, is to make Russia feel like its security interests are guaranteed, i.e. they're part of the West and not against the West, at the same time have a permanent political settlement with the Baltic states and Russia to guarantee their security, and then to abolish NATO as something that says, well, okay, if Russia is part of a pan-European strategic architecture, then NATO no longer needs to exist. That's essential to deal with the emerging geopolitical challenges. Like the alliances and policy are not identity, right? This is one of the great mistakes that I think people make. People sort of, even in US circles that are constantly against Russia about everything, there is a sense that, Russia will always be this or Russia will always be that. Well, A, I don't think they understand Russia at all. And B, it's alliances and strategic interest are a product of the structural forces we put in place. And some of the instability has been contributed to by the expansion of NATO. Now, it has had some positives. It has enhanced the security of Lithuania, for example. It's much less likely that Russia would interfere in Lithuania's internal security when Lithuania has roll gold NATO guarantees, right? So that's definitely positive. But what would be even better is if Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, these countries would manage to develop a certain rapprochement with Russia in such a way that they could have their own strategic settlement, so as that Russia could be teased out of its frozen isolation over there in the east. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, and I would take up the rest of the time if I started to address it now. Suffice to say that one thing I would like to see Lithuania do is to develop a greater sense of national pride absent Russia. So what I mean by that is, if you ask an Irish person what it means to be Irish, you'll get a long litany of amazing characteristics, right? Like, poetry and history and, sort of Gaelic sort of, traditions and Celtic traditions and all this sort of stuff, like just lots and lots of interesting things of language and many aspects of life, right? But what you don't hear is anything about the English, right? It's not like the Irish are like, oh, yes, we are Irish because we resist the English. No, you're Irish because you're Irish, and you have an interlocking history with the English that is a combination of cooperation and more often tension. The Lithuanians are still tying too much of themselves, and I say that at a national level, not individuals, too much of itself into being separate to and resisting Russia. And that stifles what I think is a real opportunity for Lithuania, which is to reconnect with all the things I mentioned in my last video about how special Lithuania is in its own right. And what I really want to see is Lithuanians, when they ask what it means to be Lithuanian, to list off things that are uniquely Lithuanian, which I think they absolutely could do. And if they did that, A, I think they would have a greater sense of pride in their own country, and B, they would be able to sit down with the Russians and talk about the historical realities between those two countries, not as a sense of personal identity, but as a sense of like, okay, well, how do we ensure this never happens again? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. I need some clarity where Russia sits in relation to the US, Russia, China, Australia. Like, where do their ideologies sit? I'm like, is Russia more aligned with China at the moment? Is that what it is?
Well, Russia is absolutely aligned with China in all but name in terms of alliance structure. So Russia and China cooperate pretty much across the board. Don't listen to people who say that, there are real limits to the relationship and so on. No, that they have a deep, enduring partnership because they see the world in similar ways. Vladimir Putin and President Xi have a good personal relationship and rapport. They cooperate in many domains, and they share pretty much completely their thinking on world affairs. So
how the heck are you going to tease them away?
Because this is a great question, because people who say this isn't possible lack imagination. I'm not saying you do that. I'm saying that I'm saying people who are international relations experts who say, oh, Russia is totally incompatible with our values, and that there is a total failure to see things clearly on a long enough time scale, right? Okay. Now, I could go into a long history of the interplay between China and Russia, going back to, before the colonial period and beyond. But basically, it can be summed up like this: deep down in the Russian soul is a Western person. And I don't mean that as like American person. I mean European. I mean, they have European values, traditions, history, outlook, titles, governance structures, art, music. It's Western. They have Western architecture, Western classical traditions of incredible composers and literary traditions. They have Western, the Tsar is Caesar, this is all part of the Europe. Their royal family had been part of the royal families of Europe, and so it's a European country, right? And deep down, and a Russian will want Europe and America to succeed against the East, right? At the end of the day, if they think forward in time, a time where China perpetually rules the world, in which they're a junior partner, okay, well, that gives them certain things. It gives them their security, it gives them influence in Europe. It means that they're not, that they're the highest rung of a group of subordinate beings operating around the Middle Kingdom, right? If they had that option, or the other option was they would be part of a victorious Western tradition in which European values and ideals and culture and traditions and narratives and stories and mythology and all of that became and remained a dominant force in perpetuity over the ashes of a Chinese failed empire, deep down, without actually admitting it to anyone, the Russians would want that more. And if you can connect with the Russian soul in that way without being caught up in Russia hysteria, then you can persuade them. And what that requires is a sustained foreign policy that makes that possible. I mean, if you have, every time someone wants to have a positive thing about Russia, a massive collective hysteria in Washington about, Russian interference in American elections and everyone being Putin's puppet and, Russian sympathies and blah, blah, all this stuff that just grossly overblows the thing, then you're never going to get anywhere. And the consequences for the West in not having Russia on side, I mean, it'll be a significant part of my upcoming book. But people seem to think that because Russia's economy is weak, that it's a kind of a withering power in some ways, that it's kind of irrelevant. And that is just so far from reality when it comes to the geopolitical grand strategy between the US and China, that it's just laughable. There's a reason why China has its arm firmly around the shoulders of their Russian friends. It's because geographically, for One Belt, One Road, for the fact that Europe is a land theatre and Russia is a land power, when China is struggling in a maritime sphere, the fact that that Russia keeps America off balance in all different ways, it's unreal. Like it gives China every single out and essentially guarantees their long-term success. If Russia in perpetuity covers their left flank. It's just such a narrow view to think that because Russia and the West don't have a good relationship right now, that is anything other than a series of bad mistakes we've made. We've made some terrible, like I just think of one, right? One of thousands I could list, like literally thousands. Like when they had the Libya intervention, like President Obama gives every assurance to then President Medvedev and Vladimir Putin that, okay, if you allow this Security Council resolution to intervene in Libya, we absolutely won't be about regime change. This will just be about protecting the people of Benghazi, right? They acquiesce. The next day, basically, NATO is bombing the crap out of Gaddafi, okay? And then we have the Benghazi taken over by ISIS terrorists anyway. So you have this massive regime change in Libya, completely burns the Russians, humiliates them publicly on the world stage, totally betrayed by what the West had said. And this is all Hillary Clinton's fault, like on her shoulders ultimately. But so that's just one of endless examples in which Russia has been left red-faced when there was an outstretched hand and an opportunity to build trust. Now, it's not to say it's all, it's all the West's fault. Like, there are questions about Ukraine, there are questions about Belarus, there are questions about the INF Treaty, like I said in the last video. But but it's not structural.
Yeah.
It's personal. And if it's personal, then you go back to the structure and you go, okay, what would be the ideal structure? Understanding Russia as it is, understanding its long-term interest, understanding in an ideal world what they would like. And it's as I've described, a world in which they're part of the West and the West, rules the world.
Heavy. Like, oh, wow.
Yeah. And look, it's something that we will hopefully get to. I mean, a lot of writing on this damn book I'm writing, like I need to really lay it out in such a way that people who pick it up understand the argument. They may not agree with it. People read stuff all the time they don't agree with, but they actually at least hear how Russia is critically important to this and be entirely on a long enough time scale able to be teased away from China. And I think the Chinese probably are more aware of this than
we are.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's very interesting.
I'll give you one quick example about China. Like Vladivostok is a city, Russia's main city on the Pacific, right? Far East. Okay. Vladivostok is a Chinese city. Like it's made up of Russians, nationalistically proud Russians. Like all the Russians that I've met from Vladivostok are proud to be Russian, even though their economy is obviously more dependent on China given its proximity than it is to Moscow. It's 13 time zones away, but they are definitely Russian people, okay? Vladivostok was Chinese prior to the Century of Humiliation. Russia was the only country to permanently annex territory from what was then the Chinese government, right? And the reason they did that is they wanted a warm water port in the Pacific, and Vladivostok was it. So if you look at Chinese maps, they still have the Chinese name for Vladivostok on those maps. They just have in brackets in Russian Vladivostok. It's not in their Chinese interest to talk about that right now, right? But they know about this, and Russians know that they know about this. Russia has this, there's talk about selling Siberia to China, that Russia only has 6 million people in all of Siberia. It's pretty much everywhere, probably 1,000 kilometers or more east of the Urals. And that population is declining. And then you have 200 million Chinese in the next province across the border, right? So Russia's sense of strategic vulnerability towards China is very acute. And there's talk of like, okay, well, how are we going to preserve our sovereignty in a world where China rules the world? They can do whatever they like, and they still have on their maps things that are traditionally Russian. What happens when they one day say, you know what, time for you to return Vladivostok to China, thanks? I mean, once China has dominance, Russia's dependence will be absolute. And they know that.
Interesting. Okay. I want to swing back to our discussion about the tension within Australia. So, yeah, again, I think it definitely is, there's more tension because each state is experiencing the virus differently. But it actually made me reflect a lot of, what it actually means to be Australian and our own identity. Because, yeah, I always regarded myself as Australian, but I'm a mixed race, clearly. And it does add a little bit of attention of, what is my identity now? Even within Australia, I don't know. Like it's different. I don't know. It's very hard to grasp because I have a lot of family in Malaysia, in Singapore, over East, all over the place. But yet I don't know where I belong anymore. Extension about it.
It's a powerful question, and I'll answer it this way. Australia, I'm going to make a bold declaration. Australia is the most, second to none, most successful multicultural society on earth, right? If you think about it, we have over 200 languages spoken every day. a huge proportion of people speaking languages other than English at home. And yet almost no domestic turmoil. Like no matter what metric you look at, violence, conflict, ethnic tensions, like all of this, of course, every society has an element, but just looking at all the stats, we don't have people from like Greece and Turkey coming over and continuing their struggles here, right? Like people tend to leave their baggage at the door when they come to Australia, but without leaving who they are. So what I find is that there's this dominant culture that everyone can be a part of because it's very easy to access, right? Like, be fun-loving, don't take things too seriously, be laid back, enjoy the massive abundance that exists around you, enjoy your friends, don't worry about things. And that's like, broadly the Australian trope, right? And then at home, people have their traditions and their ways of being. And I find that the way you interact with someone at work, let's say, where everyone and from every background happens to be present, versus if you go to their house and have dinner with them and their family, how different that experience might be, right? And where you suddenly enter a world perhaps of, of Indians or Jews or whatever the community might be, Chinese, and you're swallowed up by these traditions when you go in there. All of us have an element of duality in Australia about that, just about. Even people who are just Anglo-Celtic, kind of typical Australians, at least perceive that in their day-to-day lives with others. So the fact that you can keep both of those within oneself is a real sense of achievement for Australia.
I feel like nowadays, I feel like I need to reject part of myself because of just this much tension with China and other countries, like international, tensions, like, and then even within us, like, I feel like, should I? I don't know. And maybe it's an inner conflict that.
Well, that's the great trauma. You're right. I mean, you're not right that you have to reject an element of yourself, but you are right to draw attention to this issue because Australia has not really offended anyone ever, right? Like, we don't have massive disputes with any other nation. Our biggest fight was with like Japan over whaling, and Japan is one of our closest friends in the world. Like, we managed to have these issues without broader constraints. We have, in fact, we have good relations with all of our wartime enemies, Turkey, Germany. Like, there's no lingering vestige of hatred. And as I said in previous videos, the Chinese government at the highest levels have family here. Xi Jinping's own family has relatives living in Australia, and he's been to every state and territory personally, going on about how cute everything is. So it's not historically, we've been extraordinarily fortunate to be able to be accessible to all comers, whether you're a Russian or you're Mexican or whatever. It doesn't matter at all. But then when you've got, there is actually, particularly with China, all this talk of foreign subversion and manipulation of information and influencing the so-called Chinese diaspora in Australia and so on. I understand the legitimate concerns about that, because you don't want, obviously, a communist party trying to influence the citizens of another country based on their ethnic ties. But as an individual, it's entirely possible to be Chinese and to be Australian, right? Like, and to not feel any conflict about that at all, because you're first of all, if you wanted to be an Australian patriot without rejecting your Chinese heritage, right? it would be to distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and the rest of China, right? Nobody dislikes the Chinese people, right? You just look at the people of Hong Kong or the people of Taiwan, right? There's enormous history, thousands of years long, from the people of China making an immense, almost unequal contribution to our cultural thinking and life. That all of Asia, and of course particularly the Han, should be immensely proud. Now, that being Chinese in no way is incompatible with being an Australian. What is something that I think people who are trying to make that, and obviously I'm speaking as an outsider, but who are trying to reconcile the two, would be to say, look, there's nothing wrong with wanting a strong, proud, bold China striding the world stage with confidence, reclaiming even to a significant degree its historical position, where you can have that value, but also at the same time value individual liberty, freedom, the opportunity to speak out and criticize, the opportunity to go where you like and associate with who you wish, and not have your internet kind of controlled and monitored, not have your life subject to a social credit system based upon your perceived fidelity with the Communist Party. You can even have all your Confucian ideals if that's what you like. If you're a Taoist or a Confucian, or you have like a great, if you love your Chinese astrology or whatever, there's nothing that's incompatible with Australia about that. In fact, it's something that Australians will embrace as enriching our cultural life. We all love our Chinese New Year. We all participate in Chinese festivals and things like that happen in Australia, irrespective of whether we're Chinese or not. And that's genuine. That's not just like being polite. We wouldn't do that if we didn't want to. And so, just because politically there are tensions, then if you do believe in Australia, if you think that it's worth preserving its institutions, then all you need to do is distinguish between the Chinese people and the regime under which it lives.
That makes me feel way better now. Just because I don't agree with the Chinese Communist Party. I value human rights and I enjoy Western liberty, and I do love Chinese people. I love the food. I love the culture. I love the history. I especially love their bargaining, their business sense. They're actually incredible business people, Chinese, and they're very hardworking. And
she wishes to be like those people.
I wish to be like that. I feel like Australia is like super laid back to the point that everything is just quite slow in comparison to.
Yes, but I mean the Chinese people I speak to in business about this, because I'm like amazed as well, do say that there are massive drawbacks to this. Like there's no time for families. Like, if you're trying to look after people, you're trying to meet people, you're trying to find a partner, like it's just,
there's no balance.
There's just no time to do that. And then also there's a lot of stifle and innovation, because if you do something, someone else is going to copy it straight away. So it's so much of the emphasis is on how quickly you can do things and then move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So there's never a moment to kind of celebrate success, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
So I don't know how true that is. That's just like what people have been telling me, but it rings true, I guess.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But so society-wise, there's no perfect society, but I'd much prefer to be in Australia than China. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the time we have for today. if you found any value, I don't want to keep saying that. But if you enjoyed our conversation, please continue liking and subscribing. Helps grow the channel. If any comments and questions, please leave them down below. Yeah, that's that. Would you like to say anything else?
Yeah, no, just thank you so far. We only started this like 2.5, almost 3 months ago. And I have to say that the feedback we've received has been amazing. Even the critical feedback has been welcome and useful. So yeah, just thanks for sticking with us. And if you have something you'd like us to talk about, please let us know.
Yeah, exactly. All right. See you next time.
Ciao.